I'm Rachel from Seasonal Yoga Herts. It's amazing the different routes that people take in finding yoga and bringing it into their lives. Recently, Melissa and I have been discussing how we found yoga and the journeys that we took. So, do you want to tell me about your yoga journey? Start at the beginning. When did you first encounter yoga?
I guess probably a little bit cliche really. My mum used to practice yoga from, I was going to say DVD, but it wouldn't have been a DVD back then, would it? It would have been a video cassette. And about in my early 20s, I was in kind of like the lofty sports hall practicing yoga, and I actually found yoga. I'm not quite sure what led me to it or why I specifically sought out that class, whether it's that I obviously knew that, you know, there were benefits, but I was going through a difficult relationship at the time. So I distinctly remember really valuing that hour and a half. It was an hour and a half, and it was quite a traditional yoga class. There was like the pranayama, the meditation, like I remember doing like the candle gazing, and yeah, it was a really needed part of my life. So that was really my first introduction, and I went alone, and it was very much just me and my practice. And then just kind of thinking about, I guess, the big parts where I remember yoga specifically sticking out for me. And then the next pivotal time was I travelled to India for a course, and each morning a local swami, so like a monk, would come and take yoga on the beach for us every morning. So up we'd get, and yeah, by the sea and the sand, it was just magical. It was just such a beautiful experience, and he was amazing. He's also an Ayurvedic doctor, and he came and gave us some lectures, and he had his own ashram, and so I maintained contact with him. And a year after that course, I went back to stay in his ashram for about a month. And so it was much more of an immersive experience. We'd get up and start our practice like at 4:45 in the morning. It would go on till, 8:30, 9 in the morning. And I looked into teaching actually around that time. So that was 2007, 2008. And I just kind of set myself up self-employed, but in my previous life. So I didn't do anything about it at the time. I remember thinking 2 years, which was, I think back then, or certainly when I looked back then, there wasn't so much choice with teacher trainings, and it was like a 2 year, and I remember thinking, I don't know if I've got that amount of time to give at the moment, so I parked it. And then how I got into teaching was approaching a big birthday, starting to reflect about where I was in my life and where I wanted to be, and had started to really think about looking after myself better. I don't think I'd looked after myself very well up until that point. And so I went back to India. I closed down my company, had no job, decided I was going to go back to India and really immerse myself in yoga. And so I did for 2 months, and just to see whether it was something that I did want to commit to, whether it was that I just liked it for my own practice, or whether it was something I wanted to take up professionally, and I did.
And did you decide there and then, during those 2 months, that was what you wanted to do, or was it still slow?
It was. I came back and thought, yeah, I'm going to give this a go, but it took a while for it. I think I was expecting it to be like, oh, I found my calling and I found my path. And I didn't get that instantly, which I think is really important to say as well, actually. So after I came back from India, I enrolled on a teacher training, did my teacher training, and then started to teach. And it wasn't probably at least maybe a year. I think it was a confidence thing, and it's new, and you know, a lot of stuff comes with teaching, advertising, marketing, building up your business so that it is a business and that you're earning income. I think for me at the beginning I was spending more than I was earning. So I just feel like that took quite a while to come together, but now, you know, hand on heart, I couldn't be happier, and I couldn't imagine doing anything else. And I just love it for the many opportunities that it presents with, and the many different avenues that you can take it. And so my yoga journey continues to unfold, both as a teacher and both personally, you know, as I move through different stages of my life. I find myself leaning more towards a certain practice, you know, maybe not doing so much of one thing that I used to do, or just practicing with different teachers, you know, and discovering new things. So
it's interesting how it changes, I think, because in the time that I've taught, the way that I teach has changed. And I've gone through phases, and there'll be kind of, you know, maybe a couple of years where it'll be a certain way, and then things start to kind of gradually morph into something different. So I'm sure you're the same, that my classes have kind of travelled a journey with me as my teaching's changed. And of course some people love that and they enjoy it, and other people you kind of change in a way that isn't the way that they enjoy. But it's interesting. You don't just kind of start and that's the way that you are.
No.
It changes, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely, you know, the J word. It's definitely a journey though, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
What about you then, and your journey into yoga?
Well, my mum and dad both practiced yoga, and I grew up in London, and there were lots of books in the house about all sorts of things, but including yoga books. And I can remember being quite small and looking at, and these would be quite traditional yoga books, so they would have all sorts of interesting practices in
that a child would be interested in.
That a child would be exactly totally. So it was almost like sometimes I would go to the bookshelf and get the book out and kind of go, whoa, or look at somebody in a posture which was, you know, a posture that I couldn't imagine being able to do myself, and kind of go, wow, look at that. So it was almost, it did have a bit of a sort of you know, kind of, it was unusual, I think, and a little bit mystical, and, you know, not something that you saw in everyday life. But then on the other hand, I can remember going to a yoga class with my mum in London I guess it would be in the late 60s or early 70s, and sort of joining in. I think I was encouraged to join in, and most of the people in the class were in leotards, black leotards, because that's what you wore in those days. Really the most uncomfortable things. But leotards, and, you know, and I don't know whether this is just my memory or I have seen people in books wearing them, but fishnet tights.
Oh, nice.
Which, you know, it kind of harks back to that time. But so it kind of feels like it's always been around.
Yeah.
And then I certainly didn't practice. I can remember TV programmes being on, and there was a well-known teacher in the 70s who your mum might remember, called Richard Hittleman, who was an American teacher, and he had a little programme on Yoga for You or something like that, and he would be in the studio, and he had two lovely assistants, and the lovely assistants would do the poses and he would kind of talk about them. And I think that did, certainly in America, but probably it was also shown here, and I think it did quite a lot to popularise yoga at that time. But then when I was a sort of teenager, so still at secondary school, I was very self-conscious. I wasn't very sporty. I was the sort of person who couldn't do the cross-country runs. I was the sort of person who didn't get picked for team sports.
That kind of experience.
I wasn't liked by the PE teachers, and I know teachers aren't meant to like or not like people, but genuinely, you know, they were a little bit sneery because I wasn't very agile or coordinated, and I actually found yoga, I used a book, probably a Richard Hittleman book, and I created my own practice, and I practiced at home.
That's so interesting.
And I just, it was liberating for me, because it was for me.
Yeah.
There was no competitive element. Nobody was judging.
Yeah.
You know, other than you might judge yourself, but you know, nobody external was judging. And so I practiced fairly consistently as a teenager. Up until when I went to university, I practiced still. You know, Sunday morning, most of my housemates or flatmates would be sleeping in after a heavy night out on Saturday, and I'd be getting up and doing a yoga practice. And I can't say that it was, you know, probably by today's standards, it wasn't necessarily very balanced practice, and you know, it didn't include breath work, for example. I think I probably did do relaxation, but
you're self-taught.
I was completely self-taught. It was you know, I did a series of postures. You know, I moved myself in different ways.
Yeah.
It felt good.
Yeah.
I felt better. I did feel, you know, I might have not been able to put it into words, but I did feel that there was a sort of regulation of my nervous system, so I did feel calmer and more centred and sort of more myself, I think, really.
Yeah.
And so I hadn't attended a class up until, other than with my mum.
Yeah.
And then I think I attended my first class, I'd been my 30s, I think.
Oh wow, so quite a long time then.
Quite a long time. So I continued to practice. There were times in my life when it would take a back seat, but it always came back again in some shape or form. And then I remember going to a class with quite a middle-aged, or more than middle-aged teacher, quite an old teacher in her 70s. And as far as I can remember, that was the first class that I'd been to. Which is strange, you know. So my background is entirely self-taught. The teaching, being taught by other people, other than on the TV or in a book, that
came much later.
And then when we moved here to Letchworth, which was sort of year 2000, I found a teacher that I really liked and kind of connected with. And
I think that's so important, isn't it?
Totally. Somebody who sort of speaks to you. And I was able to attend regularly. And I remember having a conversation with her one day, and totally out of the blue, it popped out of my mouth that I wanted to teach. And I can be honest, I had not thought about it. It just came out. And when I said it, I knew that was the case. So it was quite weird, really.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So, and then that's just, you know, learning has kind of been ongoing. So there's been, you know, different teachers that I've been interested in and different sort of forms of practice.
Yeah.
To me, it's all the same stuff. It's all, you know, including the Chinese practices that seasonal yoga includes, things like Qigong. I just see that as all part of, you know, in a very broad sense of what I think of as energy practices, really. Which is why, you know, I've always actually included those kinds of practices in my class. It's not really ever been just traditional yoga. It's always been lots of different things.